A howl in the night and his breath quickens. He yearns to answer its call. More howls join the first, distant but moving closer. To him they are a dozen voices. Each of them calls his name, beckoning him. "Join us. We are waiting for you. Come and run with the pack, Fang," they said. A full moon and could already feel the tingle. Flesh shifted as did bone. Pain coursed through his body as fur spread all over. Power coursed through him, like nothing he had ever felt before. Hot like a roaring inferno it spread. Fang expected for it to consume him, to burn alive, but it didn't. While the heat seemed unbearable, he knew what to do by instinct. It had to channeled or he would lose himself in the fire. Focusing its heat, it burned away the pain as he changed. Hands became paws. Fangs grew as his face stretched. Paul Lesnar awoke covered in sweat. Rushing to the bathroom, his stomach lurching, he puked in the toilet. Lying on the cold tile, he moaned in pain. His skin crawled as bones reset and he ached all over. It had been real this time. There was no hiding the truth. Something was happening. Lying on the cold tile, Paul sucked in gulps of air, trying to steady himself. Rising slowly, he washed his mouth out to rid of the taste of bile. His body still ached as if every muscle had been torn and was re-knitting. Paul Lesnar, now at 18 years of age, had always known something was different, but it wasn't until feel his body shifting that he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt. He had seen all the horror movies, so he knew what it was. Looking in the mirror on the front of the medicine cabinet, he saw a good-looking face with brown eyes. Paul had tan skin and an average body. Most of his body was covered by hair. He definitely didn't fit the image of a male model or the physical ideal. Even now he could remember the exquisite pain it had caused, but he had to know. Focusing despite his body's reluctance, he willed himself to shift. At first there was some small hope that it had just been a dream, like all his other experiences. At first nothing helped and he gave a sigh of relief. Then he felt it deep inside, but it was different. There was no suddenness to it like before. Now the change was slow as his body now knew the blueprint it had to follow. Muscle and bone shifted, flesh stretched seamlessly. Nerve centers shut off to avoid pain, recognizing that the change was not a danger. His body was learning quickly and just as quickly, applying what it had learned. In moments, Paul's view was drastically different. Now he was close to the ground and could feel some extra. It's the oddest thing when you suddenly realize you have a tail. An extra stretch of bone and flesh, it moves without thought. Paul had always wondered how dogs made it move and tried to use it like a leg or foot. Like an extra appendage, it moved where he told it to. Well, that's interesting. Paul said, expecting only a fellow canine could understand him at this point. Walking out of the bathroom, he felt the wooden floors under his paws. Paul half expected to stumble and fall, but it felt all so natural. He had many dreams about walking as a wolf without the shifting. Last night had been the first that he had shifted from man to wolf. And thanks to all that dreaming, he knew how to walk and his body just did what he told it to do. As he moved around, Paul had an urge to get out of his apartment came over him. That part seemed not liked being cooped up inside and wanted to be out in the open. Walking over to the doorknob, looked down at his paws, realizing something. Paws aren't really designed to open doors. Rearing up on his hind legs, he balanced himself against the door as he tried to open it. Using both paws, he tried to use them to turn the thing, but they kept slipping. There was simply no way to grip with them. He thought about using his mouth, but the thought of spit all over it didn't appeal to him. The desire to get out overwhelming, he felt something stretch inside him, but it wasn't his body. It was impossible to describe beyond that, for he had no words. Like an invisible hand, whatever it was, turned the handle and swung open the door, making it slam against the wall. Startled, Paul jumped back, expecting someone to come through, but there was no one. Peeking out and looking this way and that only helped to confirm it. Still feeling the powerful urge to get outside, Paul decided to file it away for later and headed towards the stairs. Now, while walking and many other actions had been practiced, stairs are an acquired skill. Generally, wild animals don't use them. Unfortunately, Paul in his overconfidence didn't happen to take in this little fact as he took his first step and missed. What happened next was a sequence of tumbling, jolts, and pain. Crashing down the stairs, he landed in a heap at the bottom. Getting up right away, he winced as new aches spread through his body. After that spill, Paul made a note to be more careful. Making his way to the door leading outside, he tried to repeat what happened upstairs. Sure enough, willing the door open seemed to work, and the door slammed open. Heading outside, he felt the cold night air rush over him as he stood just beyond the doorway. A few cement steps lay before him, and he took his time with them. Once he was safely on the sidewalk, he headed off to his right in a trot, enjoying the sights. His eyes were a lot keener those of humans, and some would argue a dog's. Everything was in colour, but it also was brighter too when he looked around. Everything seemed more interesting, and then there were the scents. A wolf's nose, as you well know, is better than that of a human's, and Paul was taking in everything this small little city offered. Bear Lake had once been a hunter's paradise. Now those bears that were left after all that hunting had moved on. Local authorities were forced to protect them from hunters, and now it was illegal to hunt them anymore. This kept a small population of them in the area, and the locals kept clear of them. Heading out towards Grizzly Canyon, Paul made his way into the woods and away from the city lights. While they were interesting, it was the woods themselves that called to him, much like the moon. Once in the forest, Paul ran feeling the earth and dry pine needles beneath him. There was certain joy in running he had felt all his life. He had always loved it. Even when trying out in high school, he had proved himself to be one of the top runners in California. Right then, he ran faster than he ever had before. The change had brought his wolf to the surface, and they were one. He ran like a young pup, careless to the world. There was only the joy of freedom and feeling power rushing through his veins. It was like pure electricity, but so much more. He had never felt so alive. Slowing down as he neared the canyon, he panted, letting out body heat. His tail wagged with excitement and laid down in the grass. Lying on a grassy hill at the entrance to the canyon, a small brook ran just beyond it, going east to west. No. Rolling in the grass, Paul loved the feel of it against his fur and just enjoyed himself. A snap of a twig brought him to his feet, alarmed. Every instinct in him screamed danger as he caught a new scent. It was fresh, and he was downwind as the wind suddenly shifted. He heard the growl before he saw the bear. An aggressive male, it charged. Without realizing it, Paul bared his teeth and actually ran to meet him. Like two furry missiles, they collided with teeth jarring force. The bear's claws tore into his fur, and Paul bit into his chest as they rolled. Warm blood gushed into his mouth. The bear howled even as it tried to get him off. Locking his jaw, Paul held on until he was on top at the end of the roll. The jostling had ripped a large hole in the bear's throat as it bled out. Weakening, it could no longer fight as it began to die. While the bear had been quick, Paul had been much quicker by going for his exposed throat. It had been instinct. Without thinking, he had seen it and gone for the kill. The bear shuddered, taking his last breaths before Paul began to feed. The taste of blood and flesh drove him wild as he feasted on his fallen foe. When he had finished, he felt drowsy and fell asleep in the grass beside the remains. Slipping into a deep sleep, Paul found himself in yet another. In it, he wandered the woods on all fours, but something felt different. Looking around, he noticed that he was higher up from the ground than he had been in wolf form. For as far back as he could remember, the only animal he had ever been was a wolf. Walking west, he found Bear Lake and went to the edge to look at himself, like he was looking into a mirror. It was then that Paul awoke from his dream. Blinking, he looked around, finding himself in the same place he had dreamed of. He could see the clear waters, and then the image of a bear as he moved closer. "Okay, it seems like this is getting worse," Paul said to himself. Sitting back on his haunches, he tried to figure out how this had happened. In a flash of memory, he felt the raking of the bear's claws on his back, and it all made sense. Being a big horror fan, he had heard of the bite of the werewolf changing him. What if this was something similar? Maybe there was something inside him that made the bear's DNA a part of him. What was happening to him? Would he be like this the rest of his life, afraid of being scratched or bitten by a new type of animal? Willing himself back into human form, he felt himself change. The hair shed itself, falling away in clumps onto the grass. His body shrunk in size and shape until he was again his human self. At least before all I had to imagine myself as was a werewolf, now it seems I am something different, Paul said. He thought of returning to the city, but it was daylight outside. Yeah, that will go over well. Mommy, who's the naked guy? Or, dude, where's your clothes? I really don't need that, Paul thought. Until dark he would have to remain out here in the wilderness. Oh well, he thought with a shrug. I might as well enjoy myself. Shifting into his wolf shape, he noticed it was becoming even easier, and he wondered if he could force it. As he tried, pain shot through him, but he clenched his teeth and fought through. He wanted to push himself just in case he might need to change quickly one day. Too many movies of the werewolf getting killed, I guess, he thought before deciding to put all of his focus into it. He didn't have a stopwatch, but somehow it felt a lot faster. In seconds, he lay on the ground, panting but a wolf. Guess I need a little practice, Paul thought. Getting up, it hurt about as much as the first change, but he was learning to deal with it. In time, he suspected that he would be able to do it and still be able to fight or run. Right now, the trade-off was barely worth it. An enemy he came upon him quickly would find him not up to it. Paul was no fool. Even wolves had natural enemies. The bear he had met last night had proved it. A human being, even if he might have supernatural strength, was limited. We have no claws or long fangs. We are omnivores that depend on our minds and tools to survive. Any creature taken out of its element will be easy prey, and we are no different. Paul understood this. He had spent most of his life around animals. Paul had walked them and cared for them, and even worked as a veterinarian in the city. He had no illusions about what humans could do. While most animals feared humans, some were not so afraid, especially when they were starving. If that was the case, hunger could override fear in order for the beast to survive. Moving now as a wolf, he had upped his chances considerably. Out in this area, there were plenty of packs roaming around. In no hurry, he wandered the woods and took everything in. He had been in them 1,000 times as both a man in life and a wolf in his dreams. The trouble was he had never been out this far, and was lost. Even if he wanted to, Paul had no way of knowing which way was home. A fellow wolf's scent hit his nostril, and Paul, curious, decided to follow it. He had never been able to meet a wolf as an equal, and wondered what it would be like. As he neared, he heard whimpering behind some bushes. Coming around, he found a wolf caught in a metal trap. The trap's jaws had clamped down on the leg, and it was chained to a stake in the ground. As he approached, the grey wolf, who was smaller than him, looked up at the new arrival. "It hurts me and I can't get away," the wolf said. It surprised Paul that he could understand this wolf, but then again he could always understand their speech in his dreams. Like in all things, it was very simple and direct. A wolf would never be mistaken for a great orator. Paul could feel its fear and moved in to help. They were very alike, the two of them, despite the difference in size. Without it, you might have thought them to be the same species. He was definitely a male by the smell of him, and looked like a very young one at that. Looking at a trap, he was confronted with the same problem as the doorknob. Doors and traps were for hands to open, not paws. "I will try something," Paul said, focusing on making sure he was understood. The smaller wolf waited patiently. Willing the trap to open slowly, he put all his thought behind it, and slowly but surely the jaws opened. Immediately, the young wolf removed his paw, and once he was clear, Paul let the jaws slam shut. Looking him over, Paul saw that since the jaws were flat, they had not cut deep into the leg. "You should be fine. You should be heading back to your pack. They will care for you," Paul said. "I have no pack. I left it some time ago and have wandered in search of another. Where is your pack, Alpha? Shouldn't you be getting back to them? The humans hunt us from time to time when we venture too close to their territory. You would be wise to look after them. the wolf said. What makes you think I am an alpha? Paul asked, surprised, but the level of respect he sensed from the other wolf. You smell like one, of course. How do you not know this? Surely your pack should have told you. If not, you should have realized it when you began your rise through the hierarchy. The strange wolf explained. Paul remembered that wolves fought to find their place in the pack. It was necessary to find out who was above whom in status. If you always lost, then you stayed at the bottom. This was the reason why it was never a good idea to take a wild wolf and try to raise it as a pet. Eventually they would test you, and if you lost, you had to submit or die. For a wolf and some dogs, this is a reality. Instinct drives them to do it, and it allows them better access to mates. In a pack, the strongest choose the strong, so it's in your interest to be rise in the pack. Paul understood why the strange wolf was confused. If he was indeed an alpha, he was made to be a leader and one of the strongest in the pack. Sometimes there were two alphas, and they did battle to see who would rule, and sometimes the loser left the pack. Somehow Paul didn't want to give the impression he had lost, so he tried something else closer to the truth. I have never had a pack. My first day as one of our kind, I was alone. Since then I have never joined a pack, Paul said. Paul sensed the younger one's surprise. You are a strange one, Alpha. With your size alone, most alphas in this area would submit before even fighting you. You look like you can take any of them, the younger one said, moving closer as he looked up at Paul. Sniffing the air, the wolf said, You smell of bear and blood. I fought one last night. He was a large male grizzly, Paul replied. The other one seemed impressed. It was you who killed the male, the wolf said. It was, Paul answered, feeling a certain sense of pride in himself. It was not easy to kill a creature that easily outweighed you, especially when it had surprised you. Only he had made it look that way. I'm surprised he didn't tear you to pieces. You are a better fighter than I thought, the wolf said. It seems I learn quickly, Paul said, trying not to sound too proud. Perhaps we could travel together. While I am wounded, I know many packs around here. I have even seen one that is not far from here if you will follow. The wolf offered. Very well then, if you are sure you can, lead on, Paul said. They moved slower because of the smaller one's wound. Supporting himself on his other 3 legs, he made pretty good progress, Paul noticed. After a time, Paul said, Perhaps we should rest for a while. I'm sure we could both use it. He had phrased it to not insult the other wolf, and the other one knew it. He felt the young wolf's respect for him for even offering grow. No need. We should be there soon. I can manage, the wolf said, pausing only to ask a question. What is your name, Alpha? I have none. What is yours? Paul said, recognizing his human name would sound strange. I have none, only alphas have names, and they are given to him by the pack. The rest of us do not warrant it. The wolf said, That will not do. If you want, I will give you a name, Paul said, thinking. Wolves call each other by either something that reminds the others of them, or by something they have a kinship with. With that in mind, Paul wanted to commemorate the other's courage. I will call you Wounded Leg. Though I'm sure you will heal, I want to always be reminded of the day we met and our friendship, Paul said, realizing that it was a bit much. The other wolf was confused. Wolves, like all beasts, prefer to keep things simple, but did understand what had been said. I would be happy to take it as my own, Wounded Leg said, wagging his tail. Both pleased with his new name, they continued on. As they neared the pack, Paul was the first to notice it. Immediately he stopped feeling them in the very air. He sensed a dozen separate individuals, and he did not need to be told they were lycanthropes. Wounded Leg was a normal wolf, but the others were so much more. There was both a human and wolf presence in each of them. Right now the human presence was but a whisper, but it was there and he could feel it. Like an overlay, the wolf covered over the human one, until someone could barely see it. Closing his eyes, Paul reached out to them, and all their minds immediately turned to him. Their voices filled his mind. Each greeted them, and Paul saw their human faces and heard their human names. "I'm Paul," he said, projecting his mind to keep up the contact. One voice came forward saying, "Leave now." The command burst into Paul's mind, but it did not break his concentration, and it had no sting. "I will leave when I am good and ready. Who are you to show such rudeness?" Paul thought, not liking his voice. Its human name was Luke, but the voice said, "I am the alpha of my pack, and you are trespassing. Your companion I will allow in our territory, but you must leave." Paul was not thinking clearly. All he heard was the challenge, and in response he was filled with aggression. He had done nothing wrong, so why should he be treated like an outlaw? What he should have wondered was the why. Not only was Paul an alpha, but he was a strange werewolf entering another alpha's territory. A normal wolf wasn't a threat, but Paul was. Luke was treating Paul accordingly. The only trouble was, while Paul had an excuse, Luke should have known better. Paul sensed his approach and snarled at the sight of him. The two moved forth to meet each, circling as they bared their teeth. Wounded Leg could only watch as the two alphas prepared to do battle. Once battle was engaged, there would be only one winner. In a burst of speed, Luke charged forward, and the battle was joined. While Luke leapt high, Paul went low. Luke's jaws snapped shut, biting only into air as Paul was too quick for him. Unfortunately for Luke, Paul did find his target, Luke's right leg. Biting down, Paul heard Luke howl in pain. With the taste of blood hitting his tongue, Paul was consumed by a bloodlust. Letting go of the wounded leg, Paul went for Luke's exposed throat. The third wolf could only watch as Paul's teeth sunk in, and he brought Luke to the ground. Luke pressed his paws desperately against Paul, trying to free himself, but Paul slowly choked the life out of him. With a twisting jerk of his head, Paul ripped Luke's throat out, and blood covered his fangs. Luke's body spasmed as he lived out his last moments, and his eyes became jaded. Standing over the dead alpha, Paul howled in triumph. The battle had been quick and bloody, showing Paul's skill in combat. This was how the rest of the pack found them. Showing submission at his feet, they paid homage to their leader, and Paul could hear each voice as they spoke in unison. They filled Paul's mind like a flood. The old is dead. A new alpha rises. He will lead the pack and we will follow. To him we pledge our obedience. We are the pack, and you are our protector. Your voice will be pack law, and you will be the enforcer. In times of war and peace, your abilities will carry us through, and you will speak from us. Without an alpha, we are lost. We now seek your guidance. This is the law of the alpha. They said, and Paul could feel all eyes on him and could feel their strength. He saw through their eyes and felt their fears. Paul now understood what he had taken from them, and guilt washed over him. Without an alpha, we are lost. These words went through his mind as he looked on each of them. Looking deep within himself, Paul found the words he needed to say. I am your alpha, and I will keep you safe. Paul awoke with a gasp, his senses alive. The sounds of the city came at him in a thunderous rush of racket. Cars driving by, the train in the distance was loud and clear to him. What was more, his body felt hot, almost feverish. Like a living furnace, he gave off heat that spread across the room, and then he felt him. Images flashed to him as cats and dogs in the city. They noticed him for the first time, and it was not as a man. Thousands of little voices spoke to one another. Some fought for territory, others hunted for food or protected their humans and property, but he could hear them all as if they were in the room with him. His eyes became distant as he focused on each voice and felt their lives, like tiny embers giving off their own heat. A cold, wet washcloth was pressed to his head, and he turned to see an older woman who smiled down at him. Her hair was the colour of chestnut with thin streaks of white towards the front. He could feel her age, but also her power. She was a werewolf, but she was not an alpha. Who are you? Paul asked, trying to relax. His body was electric, and he could feel his power pushing against the inside of his skin. It wanted out, but he was still in control, so it couldn't go anywhere. Instead, it went deeper. to his muscle and bones, seeping into his very core. Paul felt the wolf blend with him, but he did not shift. It was different somehow, like the two sides of himself were becoming one. I'm Winter Alpha. My human name is Rachel. I am the healer among us. You are running fever. While our kind cannot become sick, it was a cause for concern. We all decided to bring you here so you could rest, she said, bringing him again back to the moment. Paul's mind had begun to drift. Now he had to focus hard not to let the power running through him take over, as it was ready to sweep him away. His blood felt like hot lava, searing his veins and arteries. There was pain, but it also felt so good. This was what he was. Not just the human part, but deep underneath the wolf. Rachel had bent close without realizing it. She could smell the scent of the wolf and feel his power. Her own wolf rose to meet his from the depths of her. Closing her eyes, she reveled in it. So pure, so powerful. I have never felt anything like this. Who are you? You shouldn't be able to do anything like this, Rachel thought as his eyes shift to that of a wolf. What do you mean? Paul thought, his mind touching hers. Rachel gasped as he felt his mind connected with hers. You can hear my thoughts? Rachel asked. Yes, I can. Am I supposed to be able to? Paul said in response. No, not in this form. As wolves, our minds are able to easily touch each other. We can even sense others of our kind up to a few miles. This is amazing, Rachel said, smiling. Brushing the side of his face, she felt not only his strength but saw his memories. You were born this way, Rachel said, her eyes widening. Is that so unusual? Paul asked aloud. It is. Such a thing is virtually unheard of. As far as most of our people are concerned, it is only legend. It is generally accepted as unproven. You are a true alpha. Do you realize what that means? According to legend, your powers make you the virtual equal of the most powerful vampires if given the chance. If the local master found out about you, she would do everything in her power to control you or kill you. You would be a great threat to her, Rachel said. Her? Paul asked. Persephone Powers. She is the leader of the Vankari in this area. The Vankari are a race of vampires, highly organized and powerful. The lady has controlled our pack for over a year now, as well as anyone else who comes into her territory. Our old allies have left us, and our old alpha kowtowed to her as if he had no spine, Rachel said. A fierce pride rose in Paul, the pride of a young alpha who did not like bowing down to anyone. Rachel's words stoked the fires of his anger red hot to a full rage. And where might I find this lady you speak of? Paul asked. You can't seriously mean to attack her first. We need allies. Help of some kind before attempting to take her on. Blood Fang, Rachel said, trying to make him see reason. Only now did she realize the error she had just made. Paul was obviously not thinking clearly. Where is she? Paul said with a snarl. Startled, Rachel backed away and Paul followed. His eyes had changed, becoming wolfish. Licking her lips, she tried to control her fear, knowing that it only excited him. The last thing she wanted to do was become his prey. Rachel told him, not expecting him to return. The lady's mansion lay to the northeast past the woods. A small winding dirt road led uphill to the top where she resided. Shifting into wolf form, Paul climbed the hill. None of the guards saw his approach as he kept low to the ground as he got close to the stone walls that surrounded the building. The mansion had only one approach, and that was through a metal gate where 2 guards were posted. Let the change take him again. Paul stopped it just before he became fully human again. In this hybrid state, he was able to control what changed and how. Focusing on his fingernails, he saw them grow into claws, sharp and tough. Climbing the final few feet to the east side of the wall, he used them to help him ascend. Senses trained for any sign of alarm, he climbed to the top, crouching down so he would be hard to see. Scanning the complex, he noticed that the security was a bit lax. Except for the 2 guards at the gate, no one seemed to be guarding the mansion. No doubt Persephone expected no one to get this far. Except for Paul, none would have without raising an alarm. Hopping down, he landed softly on the inside of the wall and quietly made his way to the door. Keeping to the shadows, he made good progress and reached the door without incident. Turning the knob, he opened the door and stepped inside, closing it behind him. He could feel her far below. Her power called out to him like a heartbeat, its rhythm steady and constant. Finding a flight of stairs at the end of a long hall, he found the ground level remarkably barren of any adornments. The windows themselves were painted over, so as not to let any sunlight in. Not trusting the stairs themselves, Paul tested the wall beside him, finding that his new claws allowed him to gain purchase. Clambering down, flight by flight he climbed down sideways, avoiding any noisy steps that might alarm anyone below. Once he reached the bottom, he let go and landed on his feet, staring into the darkness barely illuminated by torches embedded into the walls down 2 passageways. Persephone lay to the left, her presence even stronger as he drew close. He could already feel the otherworldly energy making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It had been midday when he had arrived at the mansion, so he was in no rush to get to her. Taking his time, he made his way to her, keeping a lookout for any more guards but finding none. Paul found a room with a single coffin upon a dais in the centre. He didn't have to open it to know she was inside. Approaching, he looked upon the polished old mahogany wood. He scented the air. The whiff of her perfume caught in his nostrils, and he closed his eyes, savouring the moment. His prey now lay before him, smelling so sweet and mouth-watering. Impatient to get at her, he grasped the lid, ripping it from its hinges in his haste. Metal and wood rained to thee as he looked upon her face. Her eyes were open and staring at him in abject terror and surprise. Alone and helpless, all she could do was stare at him. Bending over the coffin, he looked directly into her eyes, baring his fangs in a feral grin. "I hear tell you are supposed to be in charge around here. I can smell you, blood vampire, hear your heartbeat. You don't know how hard it is to keep from killing you, but I will spare your life this time. I am no simple beast to be ruled by anyone, be sure you understand that. The old Alpha is dead and I have taken his place. Challenge if you wish, but if you do, expect no mercy from me. I found you once and I can do it again any time I wish." Paul set his face barely inches from hers. Her heartbeat increased noticeably, being so close with a mixture of fear and something else. Paul had to pull away as he was overwhelmed with the urge to kiss her. Hearing a sound behind him, he turned in time to see a vampire attacking him. Dodging the clawed swipe aimed for his back, Paul spun and counter-attacked. Claws met flesh and the vampire cried out as he was cut. The wound was surprisingly deep, but Paul had left his mark. Unwilling to let his enemy recover, Paul leapt upon him, biting and clawing. The vampire was powerful, but not fast. After managing to dislodge him after the initial rush, he was a bloody mess and couldn't see a thing. Paul wanted to finish him, but he knew he sensed he didn't have the time. If the other guards woke up, then he would be outnumbered. Turning around, he ran out of the room at full speed, running at full speed to escape to the surface and daylight. Sounds of pursuit hounded as hundreds of feet followed him, but Paul dared not look back. Launching himself up the stairs, he easily outdistanced them and made it to the door. Once in the daylight, he saw the 2 guards at the gate running towards him, alerted to his presence. They opened up with machine gun fire, trying to hit a moving target, but Paul was moving too fast. Gathering himself near the wall, he leapt over and rolled down the hill. The drop was steep, but he made it down without a scratch. Not bothering to dust himself off, Paul shifted into wolf form again and began the journey home. Rachel had just made it home for work when she felt her alpha approach on the street. Dressed in new clothes after stopping off at his own home and taking a shower, Paul looked fine. "Did you go to see her?" Rachel asked as he drew near. She was standing at her apartment building's doorstep with keys in hand. "I did, and I told her that our pack was no longer hers," Paul said. "What if she retaliates?" Rachel asked, her face showing her worry, not just for the pack, but for him. "Any further hostility on her part or that of her people, and I will kill her next time. Would you like to go out to dinner?" Paul replied, appearing unconcerned. "What?" Rachel said, confused. I skipped lunch and I could use something to eat. Would you care to join me? Paul said. Okay, but I should change, Rachel said, wearing a t-shirt and a pair of jeans. What you are wearing is fine. Come on, Paul said with a friendly smile. Walking side by side, they found a restaurant a few blocks, and neither of them seemed to mind walking. They were halfway through their meals when Paul noticed a familiar face. Rachel noticed his smile and turned around only to gasp in shock. Greetings, Mrs. Powers. I thought you might want to talk. Please pull up a seat. Where are you bodyguards? Paul said, his face pleasant as if talking to an old acquaintance. One of them is recovering from your last visit. As for the other, he is waiting outside in the car, Persephone said, taking a seat beside Rachel across from him in their quiet little booth. You knew she would come? Rachel asked, looking from one to the other. She's curious. I imagine it has been some time since she has faced death, Paul said. He had chosen this booth carefully as it was in the far corner of the restaurant, away from any other customers who might overhear. The waitress came over to take Persephone's order, but she politely declined, and all of them watched the server leave. I am curious. Can vampires truly not eat or drink anything else but blood? Paul said, his air of pleasantness still present. Most of the time it just makes us sick. Our bodies usually can't digest anything else. Now my turn. How did you manage to get so close to me without alerting anyone? Rachel asked, her face intent on him. I'm not in habit of giving such information to an enemy, even one with a pretty face, Paul answered. And if we weren't enemies? Persephone asked. Perhaps, but then you would have to prove that, and I fail to see how that is possible, Paul said. Maybe we could offer each other something the other wants, Persephone suggested. I'm sorry, but you have nothing I want. My pack is now free of you, and as I said before, it's in your best interest to keep things peaceful between us, Paul said. Others will not accept such terms. Without the werewolves tied to me in some manner, others will see it as a sign of weakness and challenge my claim to this area. I have come here offering an alliance. My terms are simple. We combine forces and... Persephone said. And? Paul asked. You agree to at least 3 dates. I was indeed impressed by your aggressive move. In making it, you showed that you can be a worthy ally. What is more, you are quite handsome, Persephone said, eyeing him. Rachel didn't know what to say. This was the last thing she expected from the woman who held such power over Rachel's people for so long. You are serious? Paul asked with raised eyebrows. I am, Persephone said with a smile. Paul remembered the moment they had almost kissed, and he saw what was driving her. Lust. Not only had he beaten her, he apparently was her type as well. Looking at Rachel, Paul was reminded about his responsibilities to his pack. In making his challenge, he had unknowingly put them in harm's way from an outsider. If someone managed to beat Persephone, Paul would have to fight them off, and he figured it was better to keep an enemy he could keep an eye on for sure. Why take a chance for so small a price? Agreed, Paul said. Excellent. How does 7 p.m. tomorrow sound? Persephone asked. Okay, where do we meet? Paul asked. I'll pick you up at your place, Persephone said, getting up. You know where I live? Paul asked. As I said, you impressed me, Mr. Lesnar, Persephone replied with a smile as she left. What just happened? Paul asked Rachel. I think that the head of the local Vankari chose to date you rather than try to kill you. Personally, I'm unsure at the moment if you are getting off light or not. A woman like her strikes me as one who plays for keeps, Rachel said, smiling at the end. Great, I might be a vampire's boy toy. I hope you recognize the sacrifice I'm going through for all of you, Paul said, shaking his head in all seriousness. Rachel only smiled at his annoyance with the whole situation. Paul got called into work the next day, and that's when a new level of strangeness began. As soon as he entered the office, all the animals seemed to be watching him. If that weren't strange enough, he could actually understand them and sensed what they felt. Dozens of voices all at once talking inside his head. It was a struggle to just making it through the day, but he barely managed. By the end of his shift, he had a pounding headache. The trouble was, aspirin seemed to have no effect. Focusing on removing the pain itself, he felt it ease up bit by bit until it was gone. Heading home, he found Rachel in his apartment. "How did work go?" Rachel asked. "Fine, all things considered. Something weighs on my mind, though. Something weighs heavily on my mind," Paul said, closing the door behind him as he entered the living room. "And what is that?" Rachel asked. "This vampire seems to be one up on me, despite the fact that originally had her at my mercy. I don't like this change of events. Something doesn't sit right about it," Paul said, pouring a bowl of cereal. As he ate, something felt strangely unsatisfying about the cold cereal and milk, as if he craved something else. Paul's mind sought the answer, even as he ate the now bland meal, and somewhere deep inside him came the answer. "Do you normally crave a meat over other types of food?" Paul asked, turning in his chair to look at Rachel. Setting down the sports magazine she had been reading, Rachel seemed to think it over for a while before answering. "Most of the time. I'd forgotten about the cravings. It has been years since I first felt them." "How bad are yours?" And Paul's stomach growled at the very thought of a piece of meat, even something as well cooked as a hamburger. But what he really wanted was fresh meat. The memory of killing the bear was now powerful in his mind, as was the taste of him. Paul couldn't describe it in words, but that did not change the strength of the desire to hunt in the woods outside the city. Rachel had heard the grumbling of his stomach and saw the look that passed over his face. "I would say you're feeling them pretty bad right now," Rachel said, answering her own question. Her voice seemed to startle Paul, as if awakening from a spell. He looked around, suddenly realizing where he was. "Well, that was a trip," Paul said, a little surprised that he had been so overwhelmed by such a seemingly small thing. "You would have to talk to Marcus, our elder. Our former alpha exiled him from the pack because he reminded us of the old ways. He lives out in the woods a few miles to the southeast. If anyone could help you understand what your body is going through, he can," Rachel said. "I'll go right now," Paul said, setting his spoon back in the barely eaten bowl of cereal. "What about the vampire?" Rachel asked in concern. "She can wait. If I am to be at the top of my game, I must come to grips with what is happening to me first. I don't like to be thought of as a plaything. When I face her, I intend to do it as an equal, if not her superior," Paul said, not bothering to even change. He got quick directions from Rachel and headed out on foot. Once he was deep enough in the woods, he tried to shift only to become overwhelmed with a wave of dizziness. His body immediately shifted back to his human form, and he tried to catch his breath. "What the hell was that?" Paul said aloud to himself. Not daring to try again, Paul got dressed and set out on foot. After a time, he managed to break into a full run, keeping a good pace the entire way. His stamina had greatly improved, and he was barely winded as he approached the cabin Rachel had described as Marcus's home. Paul had sensed the man at a distance, and it was clear as Marcus came onto the porch that he had also sensed Paul. "Greetings, young Alpha. Word has reached me of your new position. How may this old man help you?" Marcus said. By the look of him, the old man looked like he was barely out of his 40s. Paul could pick out maybe a few grey hairs, but that was all. Paul's own parents, who were in their 50s now, didn't look as young as this man. Paul had expected someone far older from the way Rachel had talked about him. "Trying to guess my age? Good luck on that. We werewolves are notoriously hard to judge in that manner." "How old do you think I am?" Marcus said, smiling as Paul's surprise of being caught trying to figure out just that. "I would say maybe 50 at most," Paul replied. Marcus's smile grew even wider, and he chuckled a little as before saying, "I am 72 years old." "That's impossible," Paul exclaimed. Paul couldn't believe it. Looking Marcus over again from head to toe, he could not pick out one detail that would even indicate he was anywhere close to that age. This earned him a burst of laughter from the older werewolf. You'll find impossible is a word rarely used among our kind. You can consider my looks one of the advantages to being what we are, Marcus said. I wish to learn more about such things, the good and the bad, concerning what we are, Paul said. Marcus bowed at the waist in a show of respect. I am honoured to serve the new alpha of my pack. Showing him in, Marcus led him into the dining room and offered him a seat at a long, light-coloured wooden table. The place looked like a mixture of a hunting lodge and a library, with animal heads on each of the walls and books set on dozens of shelves below them. Even the furniture seemed to be made up of dead animals, leather and horns making up most of them, while the rest could have been bought at any furniture store. All were well crafted, and without knowing why, something told Paul that Marcus had made them himself. Perhaps he had even hunted them as well. As he pulled up a chair, Marcus sat across from him. Where shall we begin? Marcus asked, his voice friendly and patient. The man reminded Paul of his old professors in college, the demeanour of a person who held great knowledge and was accustomed to teaching. Not long ago, when I turned for the first time, I ventured out into the woods and fell asleep. When I awoke, I found a wild bear had come upon me, a large grizzly by the look of him. The two of us fought, and I was wounded before I managed to kill my attacker. This day, as I came to seeking other answers, I tried to shift, but found I could not, Paul said. Your body wouldn't let you, Marcus said, nodding as if he understood. Getting up, he went to one of the shelves in the living room and picked out a large red-coloured leather book. Bringing it back to the table, he opened it and set it down facing Paul. Pointing to one of the pages, Marcus said, a translation of ancient text titled The Natural Werewolf. It describes similar events. Reading the page Marcus had pointed to, Paul did indeed find events that sounded a lot like what had happened to him. So there have been others like me? Paul asked. A few, but you are different than most given an ancient prophecy, Marcus said, pausing for any questions Paul might have. Instead, Paul simply waited quietly, eager to hear more. Continuing from where he had left off, Marcus said, Among all werewolves, your kind is the most rare. I and most others are changed by a bite or scratch and are merely turned. You, my friend, were born into this. Lycanthrope DNA lies in your very blood. Without needing to bite, you can pass it on. This also means you can be infected by even non-were and take on their form as well. A prophecy spoke of such a were. It said that he will carry within both the wolf and the bear, and his coming will herald great change among all werekind. You mean there are more than just werewolves? Paul asked in shock. For almost every beast that walks upon the earth or flies through the sky, there is one who can change into them, or at least a larger version of that species. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part you can count on it. Each species of were has their own customs, usually very much akin to their beast, and each of us change between the two forms. Marcus explained. Why am I different? Paul asked. We call the natural alpha the most elite of our kind, because their bodies can incorporate new strains of both were and animal DNA. Something inside you makes this possible. This new strain adds itself on top of the original, allowing you to control it more easily, Marcus said. Well, it's not easy. My body didn't let me do it, Paul commented. That's probably because before you simply had to will the shift and your body only had one template to pick from. Now the strains have melded together to the point that now you actually have to picture what it is you want, Marcus said. Let me see if I get this straight. From now, when I change, I have to think up a detailed mental image of what I want the end result to be, Paul asked. No, just a basic one at first. After a while it will become more intuitive as your body and mind become accustomed to it, Marcus answered. How many shapes can I hold? Paul asked. I don't recommend mixing any of the features of 2 or more animals, Marcus said. That's not what I meant. I mean, how many can I hold inside my body? What's the limit, and is it dangerous to catch too many? Paul asked. Oh. In that case, I would say I couldn't tell you. As far as I know, the number is virtually limitless. though I should point out there can be ill side effects if you are not careful," Marcus said, adding the last part as he considered all the possibilities. "Such as?" Paul asked in sudden concern. "Well, you have just experienced one. Another would be that predatory animals tend to have more aggressive tendencies and urges," Marcus said. A cold chill ran up Paul's spine as he heard those words. Immediately his mind raced over the possibilities. Since wolves were very social, they would be the easier out of the two to deal with. Unfortunately, Paul remembered that grizzlies were not known for being social. In fact, male grizzlies were famous for being quite the opposite. As his mind tried to consider all the consequences of this new strain, another realization stopped him dead in his tracks. "Oh crap," Paul exclaimed. "I'm sure it is not as bad as you think. With a little training, I'm sure we can get a general handle on your two beasts by nightfall," Marcus said, trying to encourage him. "No, you don't understand. I work at a veterinary office," Paul explained, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. Marcus for a moment at a loss for words as his mind caught up to where Paul was, and all he could say in response was, "Oh, crap." Paul learned what he could from Marcus, before heading home late that night. By the time he got home it was 12 a.m, and he was exhausted from building mental shields from scratch and practicing his shapeshifting. Much to their dismay, he and Marcus discovered that Paul had indeed contracted new strains from animals that had scratched him during the day. By the time they had gone through them all, they found several dog breeds, a few cats, a rat, and finally a ferret, which was technically illegal to have in this state. But the owner of the clinic knew the pet's owner, and decided the animal shouldn't suffer thanks to a few misguided bureaucrats. During his walk home, Paul had come across a number of those same breeds and species of animals, and had heard their voices in his head quite clear, understanding every bit of what they were trying to say to each other. Most of the animals eyed him with a strange mix of curiosity and fear. What looked a man now somehow felt different to them. None approached him thankfully, as proximity only to make the voices louder to the point he started to develop a splitting headache. His new mental shields were not meant to keep anything out yet. He and Marcus had not been able to get that far in what time they had left, before he had to get home and get some sleep. His boss had made sure to give him tomorrow off, but Paul had a feeling he would need all the rest he could get. Arriving at his place, he unlocked the door and made his way inside. Rachel had been asleep on the couch, her chestnut hair splayed over the pillows resting against the far arm of the piece of furniture. When he closed the door behind him, she immediately jerked awake. "Sorry," Paul said, apologizing for waking her. "No worries," Rachel said, glancing at the digital clock on top of the TV. "You're home late. Did you decide to go out with Vampire after all?" Rachel said. Paul thought he detected the slightest bit of jealousy, but shook off the notion. "Probably just my nerves. They must be out of whack with all that is going on," Paul thought. "I spent the time with Marcus. You have no idea the mess I'm in," Paul said, sitting down next to her and laying it all out. "You've got to be kidding," Rachel said as he finished explaining. Paul shook his head as he replied, "I'm afraid not." "I'm surprised you look as good as you do. I would be completely haggard by now," Rachel admitted, admiring his fortitude. "Marcus says my internal shields are good, but I'm sure now that I'll have to pay him another visit tomorrow, just to put some shields against the outside world in place. The headache I have right now is excruciating," Paul said, rubbing his temples, wishing that the pain would just go away. "Can't say that I envy you. I have only one beast to keep track of, and that can be difficult enough if I don't pay attention to it. The shields he helped you put up must be on the edge of bursting," Rachel commented. "They seem solid enough for now. Thankfully I'm picking up things quickly," he says, "though not quickly enough for my tastes," Paul said, bowing his head for a moment. When he raised his head to look at Rachel, he noticed her deep in thought, and he had a peculiar feeling in response to the look of curiosity on her face. "What are you thinking?" Paul asked, deciding to listen to the feeling. I was just wondering what it would be like to be a lion. I was always fascinated with them as a child. I've actually visited the small zoo downtown that has a lion enclosure." Rachel said, with a sense of childlike wonder on her face, before she eyed him expectantly. It took a moment for Paul to follow her line of thought to its conclusion. I am not turning into a lion, Rachel, Paul said, unwilling to even consider such a silly idea, least of all the fact that it would require him to get injured by the animal's claws or teeth to even accomplish such thing. But, Rachel began. No, Paul said, pointing at her with emphasis. Look, you wouldn't even have to be injured. Rachel said, her curiosity and excitement overriding her good sense. It was her choice in wording that stopped him from delivering an automatic response. What did you just say? Paul asked. Rachel, suddenly realizing her blunder, replied, Nothing. Heading to the kitchen, Paul picked up the telephone on the counter and dialed the number Marcus had given him. Hello, Marcus's sleepy voice said. Obviously he had been asleep when the call came in. It's Paul. Did you lie to me when you told me I can only get a new strain from biting or scratching? Paul said. Somewhere in the back of his mind he could almost see the older gentleman trying to wake himself up, as Paul's question had hit him with the force of a ton of bricks. Well, Marcus hesitated. You lying bastard! Paul shouted as he suddenly became filled with rage. Now just calm down, Paul, Marcus said, glad that he was safe miles away from his alpha's wrath. Rachel could feel the power, fueled by his anger, pouring off of him and practically scorching her in the other room. Animals throughout the neighborhood began to speak out in protest, and the night was filled with their sounds. Quiet! Paul shouted in annoyance, his will pouring out to each of them, and just like that they were suddenly silent. Not a single creature within 5 city blocks dared move or speak. Well, that was impressive, Rachel said, and immediately regretted when his gaze fell on her. Predatory eyes beheld, whether they were wolf or some other beast she did not know, nor did she care as they seemed to burrow into her. Any other comments quickly died in her throat under the menace held in them. When he turned his attention from her, Rachel barely resisted the impulse to sigh in relief, lest she risk those eyes finding her again. You better start talking, old man. I can already feel those shields of mine crumbling, and we both know I don't have to be in the room to get at you, Paul said as he registered their connection loud and clear. He could almost smell the fear coming off Marcus as he realized just how bad he had blundered. My king, I meant only to not worry you. The answer to your suspicion is yes. As long as a foreign strain enters your body, be it by flesh blood or some other transfer, the new strain will become a part of you. I apologize for withholding such information from you. I assure you it will never happen again, Marcus said as calmly as he could. That same calmness slowly leaked across their connection, and Paul began to calm down. See that it doesn't. I will visit you tomorrow. Be up early, Paul said. He could hear Marcus apologize again, even as he hung up the phone, still irritated at man. Retiring to his room, he growled as he walked, using it as an outlet to vent his frustration with both Marcus and Rachel. The next morning, before the sun rose, Paul was already knocking on Marcus's door. After the third knock, Marcus opened it and showed him in. We have a lot to talk about, Elder, Paul said, allowing the other man title he held in the pack. Marcus recognized it as a reluctant show of respect, and he could hardly blame Paul for his reaction given the circumstances. They sat down at the dining table again like before, but it was clear now that their relationship had changed, perhaps permanently if Marcus was not careful. He understood quite clearly that he had overstepped his bounds and was at fault for Paul's sourness. As powerful as he was, Paul was still a young man, new to the life of the Were in all practical matters. I am prepared to explain all that I can. What does my alpha require of me? Marcus said with all humility. Tell me everything you know, Paul said, sitting back in his chair. That will take some time, Marcus commented. Then we will be here for a while. My rivals possess knowledge I do not have, and I hate being kept in the dark. If you want me as your alpha, you will give me the information I need to lead. Culture, relevant, history at the very least. Tell me what I must expect and give me your counsel. While I may not always follow it, I will take it into account, Paul said. And if I hold anything back? Marcus asked tentatively. Then I'll leave you to fend for yourselves and be on my way, Paul said coldly. Marcus nodded in understanding. He had seen other alphas come and go. He understood what it took to be a good alpha, and had seen many lose their coveted place in pack. Each of them had been too human. Fang possessed a ruthless cunning they were incapable of. If Marcus held back even a little and Paul sensed it, the younger man would leave the pack leaderless. Marcus knew the pack had no one who was up to the challenge. The former alpha had beaten them into submission far too well. Without a strong alpha to give them strength from his or hers presence, they would crumble and be swallowed up by another pack. Their only chance to survive was with him leading them. Taking deep breath, Marcus said, I suppose that's a fair deal. As you have already guessed, our culture depends on dominance. Much like the wild packs, we structured into individual hierarchies, making up each group. Only alphas and their mates are given names. Normally we are called by the city we live by or after the ruling alpha. Our domain is the wilderness. We are separated from the humans and have always remained the outsiders. If they knew who we were, they would no doubt hunt us, for we are more frightening to them than even the vampires. We represent the wilderness that does not live by society's laws. We are free and strong. This is your heritage, young alpha. You were born to be a ruler among our kind, and if you are the leader of prophecy, great things will come to pass because of you. In you the beast is the strongest, while with the rest of us there is still a small separation. We can hold back the beast and not lose ourselves for a time, but you cannot? And why not? Paul asked. Because you are the beast. Like the first of us, spoken of in legend, you are the wolf trapped in a man's body. The old tales speak of you and give examples of what you are capable of. Though you can live among humans, you feel different, and it is not simply because of the change. Your mannerisms are like those of the beast. Human law is a secondary concept. What you desire most is to be free of them. If you find yourself locked in a room, you will struggle to get out. Marcus explained, and Paul could remember such incidences, one in particular. Once he had been locked in a closet by one of his older cousins during a birthday party. Not only had been so desperate to get out that he had clawed at the walls in a panic, he had rammed himself against the door. Eventually someone had heard him and let him out. Paul's hands had been bandaged, and the whole time while the adults had fussed over him, his eyes had been on his cousin Greg. The boy had been older than him by 3 years, and had towered above him. But Paul had not cared. He would not be bullied, and most of all he wanted revenge for being trapped and terrified. Greg had been standing with his friends off to the side, joking about the whole thing when Paul had tackled him from behind. Caught by surprise, he was unable to mount a defense before Paul started hitting him. Though the other boys pulled him off, Greg was left petrified after looking into Paul's eyes. Paul could only guess now what his cousin had seen that day, but whatever it was, Greg never went near Paul again for any reason, and he wasn't the last. Had the wolf been picking out from behind its human mask even then? That realization was a shock to Paul's system. How many times had he acted so strangely? Was that why he had so few friends growing up? Why he always felt out of place except out the wild or with animals? Even then, he must have felt the beginnings of what Marcus was talking about, but he had dismissed them at the time. Now he couldn't. Marcus saw the emotions that raced across Paul's face and felt pity for him. The man must be very bewildered to let down his guard down this much. The rest of the day was spent teaching Paul the ways of their people, and how to shield against the outside world, or if necessary, how to sense more of it. You are a marvel to behold, Alpha. To understand us, and use our abilities, you only have to give in to instinct, not think and concentrate as we do. With practice, each ability will come on its own, in crystal clarity. It will be intuitive and efficient. You will not have to waste time worrying and adjusting. You will simply be. Marcus said, trying to express the wonder that thought was supposed to hold. But he didn't understand Paul. As wise as he was, how could he? The more Paul learned, the more he came to understand that even among the Were he was different. A part of him had welcomed the thought of being accepted by those like him. It had never been a conscious desire, but it had obviously been there underneath the surface. Now he had nothing to take comfort in. In his mind, he had more in common with a wild wolf than the pack. A great part of him wanted that simplicity, to live in the moment and not have to worry or plan. The wilderness called to him, offering a way out of the trap he was in. He could run away and leave all this behind, perhaps join a wild pack and live as they did. Looking down at his hands, he saw for the first time that his body had meant to be a prison, and a well-designed one at that. Man and wolf were supposed to be at odds, offering a balance that allowed a werewolf to live in either world. Paul had no such balance. In his case, the wolf had been tricked to believe it was a man. His entire life had been a well-orchestrated lie. I am the wolf. The separation I have imagined is an illusion. If that is the case, then what do I do? Who am I? What is real and what is not? What do I hold on to? Paul's mind thought as it was overwhelmed with these questions and so much more. As he left Marcus's home, he walked alone underneath the moon and the stars. Had the first were been like him? Had they been fooled by some elaborate setup to walk and live as humans, walking on 2 legs instead of 4, and speaking and acting as they did? Or had they realized what they were and fought against some ancient force that had drawn them and humans together? Paul was so engrossed in his own thoughts that he almost didn't feel her presence until he was almost on top of her. Stopping, he listened, but she gave no sign of movement as she waited ahead. Part of him wanted to walk around and avoid her, but that might not be possible. Besides, he was not in the mood to run right now. Stealing his features, Paul stepped out of the woods and said, "Hello, Persephone. What brings you here?" The female vampire smiled her face, carrying within it a serene beauty. Paul found the effect breathtaking. He was reminded of photos of Greek sculptures he had seen in college. Her features reminded him of a Greek goddess, her power strong yet calm. It was that same inner strength or energy that brushed against his own, its touch cool and soothing to his soul. "You missed our date," Persephone said finally. "I've been busy," Paul said. "So I hear. How is Marcus, by the way? I must admit I missed his company when the old alpha cast him out." Persephone asked, her voice as calm and soothing as the rest of her. Paul, however, refused to be soothed. Using the image of the injustice done to Marcus as a rallying call, he brought forth his anger, slamming it into the woman. Persephone gasped as she was knocked back a few steps by the force of it. "An action you caused. I've made it quite clear I will not bow and lick your feet as my predecessor did. If that is what you intend, then you might as well cast off such a notion now, because it will never happen," Paul said. Persephone seemed almost hurt by his words as she replied, "You treat me as if I were your enemy. But you are. As long as you have designs on my pack, then that is all you will ever be. You will never control them through me, that I can promise you. If I include them at all, it must serve their interests as well," Paul said. "And if I seek only you?" Persephone asked, her eyes strangely focused on his. Paul did not like this change in focus and wondered what it meant. He was tired of this woman and suspected she was toying with him. How old was she? Surely she could not be serious in considering him a mate. The word held powerful meaning for him. Among the Were, it was like a husband or wife, but for him it was something far more primal. Someone that he belonged to and she belonged to him. The urge to find a mate was powerful in him now that he had reached adulthood. It would drive to seek out a female and bear young with her, spending the rest of his days happily at her side. Surely she could not understand such a foreign principle to one of her kind. "Explain yourself. It is late and I wish to retire for the night," Paul said guardedly. "I mean, I am interested in you," Persephone said. Paul's eyes narrowed in suspicion as he said, And why is that? We have a connection, you and I, and you know it, Persephone said, full of confidence. I know I felt something when we first met. Such a thing could merely be a sign of two powerful beings meeting. No one can be sure, Paul said, making an effort to brush it off. I can. I have lived a lot longer than you have, Paul, and I have met beings more powerful than either of us. Power alone does not create such a sensation. It has to be something more, something deeper, Persephone said. I desire no deeper connection to you, Paul said, making a move to walk past her. That is because you have not bothered to think of what I can offer you, Persephone said. And what is that? Paul said, humouring her. A chance to not be alone. Both of us are different than the rest of our kind. My sire said as much about me when she made me, and you feel different than the other where I have met. I'm not sure what it is, but it sets you apart from them, and I imagine how lonely you must feel, Persephone said. Paul tried to challenge that statement, but the words would not come. And if this is not love or what you say, Paul asked, then I will accept that, but at least for a while a tentative relationship is better than none, don't you think? Persephone asked. It is, Paul had to admit. In that case, would you care to have dinner with me? Persephone asked with a charming smile. Paul walked into his apartment 2 hours later to find Rachel waiting for him, sitting up on the couch. You're home late, Rachel commented indignantly. I was unaware that I had to ask you permission to stay out late, Paul said with a raised eyebrow. My apologises, Alpha, Rachel said, recognising her mistake. Sitting down in the love seat across from her, Paul said, Marcus explained to me why you are here. I had to admit I was wondering. Every new wear is expected to have someone to look after noon. It's tradition. It helps with the transition, Rachel explained. In that case, you won't have to be here much longer. Marcus has been an excellent teacher, Paul said, watching for her reaction. A look of disappointment showed on her face, confirming Paul's suspicions. Whether she realises it or not, Rachel misses her old position in the pack. Living here with me possibly gave her an excuse to keep something of her old position, and I can't blame her. Paul thought, understanding the need to belong, still there would have to be ground rules that needed to be established. If you wish to stay, then you have one of two options. Either you can pay rent or keep the apartment clean. This is my home, not yours. So I say what goes. If you don't like that, then you are welcome to walk out that door any time. One more thing. Here you call me Paul unless we among other members of the pack, Paul said, getting up. Thank you, Paul, Rachel said, a grateful look crossing her face. Make sure you turn off the lights when you go to sleep, Paul said, heading down the hall to his room. Paul was finishing his shift when his boss approached him. Washing his hands in the sink inside the examination room, he dried them with a paper towel and turned to greet her. Hello, Mrs. Stevenson. How may I help you? Paul asked with a friendly smile. His boss was a kind woman who looked out for her employees. Every one of them had a good benefits package and a good work environment where each felt valued. Hello, Paul. I'm afraid I have some bad news. Would you like to step into my office? Mrs. Stevenson said. Of course, Paul said, already bracing himself for what was to come. Following her to her office down the hall to the left of the exam room, he closed the door behind him and took the seat offered him. The owner has been bought out by a large corporation, and they want to close our clinic so they can restaff. Very few people are supposed to make it through the merger, and I thought it best to provide you with a choice. I've managed to arrange for you to find a job at our local police station. Their K9 unit could use a new head veterinarian, she said. I'll take it, and thank you, Paul said. When he performed his last examination that day, Paul hugged her and said his goodbyes. The next day he had an interview with the chief of police, but at this point it was only a formality. He had worked at the police station when he had been back in college, and he knew Dan Rotherson. The man's head was completely bald, and he had a stocky build. The smile on his face was a welcome rarity, Consider it was normally so grim and serious. Paul had known the chief his entire life, as he and Paul's father had been partners, before his old man had quit and moved away with Laura Lesnar, Paul's mother. They had always been very private, and even Paul had been a stranger to them. At the time he had felt his father had disliked him somehow, but now he understood. Tom Lesnar had kept an awful secret all of his life, and out of habit pushed people away. Paul's biological mother had left when he was just a baby, and Paul had little doubt that she had discovered that secret and had taken the opportunity bolt, the first chance she got. Paul looked a lot like his father, but beyond that, they were as different as night and day. Tom Lesnar was a loner, while Paul had spent most of his life as the leader of a crowd, from his short stint as a biker right out of high school to student body president in college. It had only been in his professional life that he had withdrawn even slightly from public, but he was certainly in a position of authority again, being the head of a werewolf pack. Paul wondered how different his life might have been if his father had just come out and told him. His last conversation with his old man before he disappeared had been spoken in anger. The last thing anyone had seen of the senior Lesnar was him walking into a nearby woods and just disappearing after Laura died of cancer. "I understand you now, Dad, at least partially. When Mum left, it was like she was calling you a freak, so you separated yourself from anyone who might hurt you in the future. But Laura, my real Mum, fell in love with you. You couldn't help yourself and reciprocated her feelings. With her gone and you and I estranged, you had nothing left to keep you in the human world, so you chose to lose yourself in the wild." Paul thought, regretting his choices back then. Had he known, then he and his father would have been drawn together by their shared secret, and might even have supported each other after Laura. Now Paul realized that they might never get the chance to reconcile, not unless he was willing to do something about it. "He's a werewolf like me and an alpha besides. I bet he still lives near her grave, and now I have the means and the will to find him," Paul said. Calling home, Paul said, "I'll be heading out of town for a few days. Take care of the place while I am gone." "Where are you going?" Rachel asked, and Paul could feel her worry. "Not far, why?" Paul asked, concerned that she was worried about something. Renting a car, Paul drove out to Westwood Falls, where his father had last been seen. It was a quiet little town, up in the mountains. Renting a room at an affordable motel, Fang headed into the woods on foot, leaving the rental car in town. Heading southwest, he waited until he was clear of any people before shifting. Changing with ease, he broke into a run when the change had finished, eager to find his quarry. Every sense was alive as he sped through the underbrush, beneath the thick canopy of trees that allowed little sunlight through. Fang travelled for some time, going up and down the slopes of the mountain as he searched for any trace of his father. Eventually his determination paid off when he felt a vague presence up the slope he was currently standing at the bottom of, towards the north. Circling around the mountain range, he was now on the western slopes. More rock near the bottom. A wolf or man would have a hard time finding their way up the mountain from this point, as the climb itself could prove far too treacherous. But then, I'm far from normal. Fang thought before he shifted into a cross of wolf and man. Using this mixed form, his skin had some protection against sharp rocks, while his claws in their present form proved excellent for climbing. He couldn't help but smile as he thought about what he must look like. If any tourist or local saw me right now, I would probably make this place a great tourist attraction. They might even mistake me for Bigfoot at a distance. Gathering himself, Fang leapt up, digging his claws into the rock face. Fang began his climb. Powerful muscles worked together, ensuring his ascent went as smoothly as possible. Pulling himself over the top edge, Fang found himself at the edge of a cliff. Before him was a long line of trees, and in them he felt his father's presence as he purposely kept a distance from the newcomer in his territory. Changing back to his human shape, Paul stood naked as a cool breeze blew. "Don't be afraid. It's me, your son Paul. I've come to see you and wish you no harm," Paul called out with his mind. His father's initial response was pure emotion, as sometimes happens when dealing with a wild animal. It was to be expected. Tom Lesnar had no doubt spent years away from humans. To speak their speech once again after being alone for so long would prove difficult. At that moment he understood the tone of Paul's message more than anything. Instead of trying to communicate with words his father would not understand, Paul did so with images. Showing his old man an image of Paul waiting for him, he then waited for his father to come out to see him. When Tom Lesnar did appear, he was tentative in his approach. Paul made sure not to make any sudden movements, so as not to spook him. The two men looked very much alike. One could say that Paul was a younger version of his father in the strength of their resemblance. When he was barely 10 paces away, Paul's father became so overwhelmed with emotion that he rushed forward and embraced his son. Father and son changed and raced under the shade of the treetops, happy in each other's company. Late into the night they ran, seemingly tireless in their strides. When the dawn came, they slept in a cave Tom Lesnar often visited. As they slept, Tom remembered all that he had left behind. He saw his dead wife's face and his children, including Paul. The following sunset, Tom watched his son as he slept. When Paul opened his eyes, he found his father smiling down as he sat up beside him, his legs crossed. "How long have you been awake?" Paul asked out loud. "Some time now. I would estimate a few hours," Tom said. "I'm surprised I did not sense it," Paul commented. "It is to be expected. Everyone has a blind spot, my son. I am yours just I once had mine. Everyone else you will be able to keep track of, especially when you focus yourself." Tom explained, happy to see his son. "It's good to see you again, father," Paul said, voicing what he had already shown in his actions. "As I am glad to see you, my boy. Tell me what you have been doing with yourself. How is your brother?" Tom asked. "I have not spoken to Will in years. Last I heard he was living in New York. I don't know what he has been doing. I studied veterinary medicine and was working as part of a practice until recently," Paul answered. "Recently?" Tom asked. "A lot has happened, Dad," Paul said. "Explain it." Tom said, so Paul did. When he was finished, Tom smiled proudly. "The alpha of your own pack. Congratulations, son." "It's not all that it is cracked up to be, father. I didn't ask for it," Paul said. "You spoiled pup," Tom shouted, anger boiling off of him. "What? What did I say?" Paul asked, shocked by his father's response. "You have been given the greatest charge an alpha can hope to attain. Most dream of being given that responsibility. Every fibre of your being should yearn for what you now have. Others would kill for it. I know I would. Only a weakling and a coward would deny who and what he is. You are an alpha not just by your bloodline, but because you are what you were meant to be, the ruler of a pack," Tom said. "Be careful who you call a weakling or a coward old man," Paul said with a growl. Tom returned it, baring his teeth as he said, "I am not too old to take what you obviously don't deserve." "Try it, old dog, and I'll crush you," Paul said. Roaring Tom attacked, his fingernails turning into claws. Paul dodged the first swipe and gave a return stroke his own, carving into his father's chest. Pain gripping him, Tom fought on, but he was no match for the younger Paul, who was far more accustomed to fighting on 2 legs. Their battle lasted barely a minute before Paul carved him to shred and left his father lying at his feet. "You want the pack, old dog, you can have it. I give to you, for you deserve each other. Both of you represent now unwanted elements of my past," Paul said, and left his defeated rival in that cave. Paul drives home with his thoughts on what happened between him and his father. Guilt washes over him that he allowed things to go so badly. Inside his apartment, Rachel waits, and Paul tells her what happened while he was away. "I would not blame you if you wish to leave. I do not imagine I would prove to be good company in the days ahead," Paul said as he stood in his own kitchen, with her looking at his back just a few feet away. "As long as my I Alpha needs me, I will serve. Perhaps you should get rest. The time is late," Rachel replied. "I am tired. Thank you for being here," Paul said, thinking about every mistake he had made up until that point, and perhaps he could be free at last from the great responsibility put on him. When Paul awoke the next day at 8 a.m, he found 2 messages on the answering machine. Pressing the button to play them, Paul listened to both. The first message was from the Chief of Police. "Dr. Lesnar, it's 12 p.m. and you still haven't shown up for our 8 a.m. meeting. Please call me when you get in." Hearing the beep, marking the end of the first message, Paul sat down on the coach listening for the second. "Dr. Lesnar, it's the Chief again. Your father contacted me and told me what happened. I would like to reschedule our meeting." The Chief's voice came over the answering machine. "My father?" Paul said in shock. "He arrived late last night and took over the pack. Only a few challenged him and he defeated them all," Rachel said, coming out of the hall. Paul turned to look at her. Considering her words, he shrugged. "It is as it should be. My father will be the alpha they want. I am done with it all." Getting up, Paul walked over to the phone and dialed the Chief's number. When a desk sergeant answered, Paul asked for the Chief and gave his name. "Hello?" the Chief asked. "Hi, this is Paul Lesnar. You left a message that I should call," Paul said over the phone. "Hello, Mr. Lesnar. Yes, I did. Could you meet me today at 10 a.m? the Chief asked. Paul glanced at the clock again to note the time and said, "I believe I can manage that." "All right, 10 o'clock it is. Call me if you're going to be late," the Chief said. Paul showed up at the station and was shown by one of the officers on duty to the Chief office where he was waiting. The 2 men shook hands as the officer left and the Chief offered him a seat. "So you must be happy to have your father back in town," the Chief ventured with a friendly smile. "It's been interesting so far," Paul said. "Reunions between estranged family members always are. How is your brother, by the way?" the Chief asked. "We haven't talked in a while," Paul said. "Well, I suppose one thing at a time. You come highly recommended by 2 people I've come to respect over the years, and I know you personally. As long as you show up on time and perform to your ability, I see little problem in hiring you, and I was hoping you could start tomorrow at 8 a.m, the Chief said. "Sure, I'll make sure not to be late." Paul rose up out of the chair and offered the Chief his hand. "See that you do, Mr. Lesnar. Friend of the family or not, I've already shown as much favoritism as I am going to. After this, you are on your own," the Chief said. "I won't let you down, sir," Paul said before leaving. Paul showed up early the following day to his new job, eager for a new beginning. No longer would he be an alpha, and worst case scenario, he could at least pretend to be normal. When the first dogs came in, he began their checkups, trying to hide the fact that he could hear them. He succeeded as far as the police were concerned. The dogs, however, knew better. Watching his every move, they reacted to his every word and intention as if they clearly understood, and indeed they did. In an odd way, Paul found it comforting. When his shift ended, Paul wandered the streets and listened with a sense of joy. Finding his way to the edge of the city, he found a hill overlooking it. Seeing the city below and the moon shining overhead, embraced what he was and howled. The dogs of the city took up his call, hailing their king, and Bloodfang's call echoed across the countryside, its power weakening beyond the city. Among the beasts of the city, new were made and left the city to follow the call. Bloodfang waited for them, and within an hour they were gathered around him. Tigers, cats, dogs, birds, rats and every other pet or creature that lived there. Not all the animals of the city were changed, only a handful of each in fact that now stood naked in human form, but these were new, and all recognized Bloodfang as their alpha. "I give up a pack and instead I am given a nation. It seems I can no longer run from what I am. So be it. Come, young ones. There is something I must do," Bloodfang said, shifting into wolf form and leading the way into the woods. Shifting into their animal forms, the new were followed. Tom Larson, like the rest of the pack, heard the echo of the call, but they did not feel its intended effect. To them, it was just a call they recognized, and Tom was not surprised when his son appeared, though he was interested why so many strange new were followed him. I have come for what is mine father, Bloodfang said, wolf to wolf. Some members of the pack growled at Bloodfang and those that accompanied him, but Tom silenced them. It is yours if you truly want it, Tom said. I do, Bloodfang replied. One of the males from Bloodfang's old pack couldn't believe it. You are not even going to fight for it? We already have. I don't imagine anything will change from last time, Tom said. Then I claim this pack as my own, unless any would like to challenge, Bloodfang said. I would. The male who had spoken up earlier said. Bloodfangs moved before the other knew what was happening. The challenge had been offered and the other male was caught by surprise. As Bloodfang attacked ferociously, whimpering and biting, the challenger tried his best to fight, but he was quickly overpowered and he was forced to give up. Laying on his back, he stayed in a submissive position, whimpering at his wounds as Bloodfang growled and bared his fangs. When it was clear that the challenger was done, Bloodfang said, Are there any others? No one challenged him after that, and Bloodfang let the challenger up. These are now as kin to you, and shall be treated accordingly. They belong to me just as you do, Bloodfang said, and watched the pack greet the new wear. A presence nearby attracted Bloodfang's attention, and he left his pack to meet her. Persephone smiled when she saw him approach in the form of a wolf. I was wondering when you would return here, she said. Shifting into human form as he approached, Paul said, I had some things to think about. I... Persephone's words of admiration at the sight of his physique were cut off as Paul kissed her. Paul awoke to find his father looking down at him in human form. Well, I imagine you've been busy. Your companion retreated to the safety of her home before dawn came. By the look of her, she had a roll in the grass. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, son? His father said. Spying on me, old man? Paul teased back. Merely looking out for my new alpha. She is beautiful, son, but... Tom started to say. But she is a vampire. It's complicated, Paul said. Not really, Tom said. You just said... Paul said, suddenly confused. I was simply stating the obvious. I also said she was beautiful, and as long as she likes you like her, then I fail to see a problem. Live your life, son, Tom said. What should I do? Paul asked. Well, normally you would take her to dinner before sleeping with her. Now I think you at least owe her the first part, Tom answered. Paul sensed something in the background, a presence that was barely there one moment, and then gone before he could locate it. Whatever it was, he had never felt it before, and what bothered him the most was how quickly it disappeared without a trace. Sniffing the air, he searched all around the immediate area and found a new scent by a tree. It was a good hiding place to watch him and his father, and not be seen. Tom walked up to the spot from behind him and said, What is it? Someone was watching us from this spot, Paul said. Tom's eyes searched the area and they stopped at the shadows around the tree. It disappeared suddenly. How did you know that? Paul asked. A shadow jumper. The question is, who does it belong to? Tom said. What's a shadow jumper? Paul asked. A vampire who can use shadows to cloak and jump from place to place. Despite what you may have assumed, they are the frontline troops of the Vankari. Able to disappear and attack at will, they ideally suited when used effectively, Tom explained. Do you think Persephone sent this one? Paul asked. It doesn't feel like her. No, from what you've told me, it doesn't fit her MO, or at least she wouldn't have gotten caught. This is the first one you've sensed, correct? Tom said. Yes. If this one doesn't belong to her, who would he belong to? Paul replied. A rival house or clan. The Vankari have a number of them. Each of them watch the others for a moment of weakness. Your recent rise to power might have been seen as an opening by one of Persephone's rivals. If that is the case, a hornet's nest will be stirred up when the powers within the city become aware of this, Tom said. What other powers? Paul asked. Persephone's group isn't the only vampire race in the city. If past patterns hold, then there should be Revenant and Keepers here as well. They are enemies of the Vankari and are hunted down if they enter Vankari territory, Tom explained. Why are they enemies? Paul asked. Old bad blood between them, who knows? The point is that each group has carved out a niche in the city for themselves. The Keepers to the west, the Revenant to the east, and the Vankari to the south, Tom said. Why didn't Persephone tell me this? To hear her tell it, she rules the city, Paul said. That's because she is a vampire. It's a habit of theirs not to display weakness just as we do. In both our worlds, such behaviour only invites an aggressor to possibly finish us off. In possibly securing you as an ally, she strengthened her position. As long as it looks like you aren't with her, then she is vulnerable. Do not think less of her for it. She must be a leader first, Tom said. And so must I. I don't like being lied to, Father, and to make matters worse, if I'm seen with her, my people may be attacked because of it. I can deal with them not liking the idea, but making them targets is something else, Paul said. You are overreacting. Danger always exists in our world. Don't let it affect you, judgment, Tom said, trying to change his mind. I've made my choice, Paul said, and started turning around to head back to the pack. Tom stepped in his way and said, Would you rather deal with the devil you know or the one you don't? What are you talking about? Paul asked. I'm talking about Persephone. Put aside that you care for her as you should. Think instead as your relationships as leaders. Of course she won't do anything to betray her people, just as you won't. Both of you are loyal, and outside of hiding the chinks in your armour, both of you are managing to get along better than any vampire or werewolf has in the past. You aren't at each other's throats, and with you two, peace is possible. Making peace with her and staying allies at least until any possible threat passes will help everyone, including the humans of this city, Tom explained. Paul's gaze became introspective. I had forgotten about them. You are right. I can't let innocents suffer when we are far better prepared to handle the situation. Werewolves have been fighting vampires for centuries. If need be, we'll do it again. I have to talk to Persephone. Another presence appearing right behind them spun Paul around. Ready to attack, he saw the vampire had made no move to attack and did not offer any movement or gesture that might be perceived as a threat. Who are you? Paul asked. I am Vertek. My lady has asked for you. The very young-looking male said. So do we walk? Paul asked. If you'll take my hand, sir, I'll jump us there, Vertek said. Paul expected his first jump to be a more jarring experience, but exiting the jump proved to be quite a smooth transition. They stood in a living room in what Paul knew was Persephone's residence, as much of the room and its furnishings were permeated with her scent. A picture on the coffee table confirms this conclusion, as it shows a picture of Persephone in an old black and white picture. Sensing her enter the room from behind him, Paul turned to greet her. Glancing at the picture, Persephone said, Very few of my kind like pictures, as it leaves a visual record of our existence. I myself have posed for a number of pictures and paintings, though I always buy the finished product just to be safe. You might say I am a collector of vampiric art, and I have bought every example of it I can, storing it in my own private vault, but of course that is not why I brought you here. I understand things are more complicated than I was originally made aware of, Paul said, letting some of his annoyance leak into his speech. Persephone actually had the good grace to be slightly embarrassed for her part in that, which actually helped her case with Paul. With a gesture from Persephone, Vertek left the room, leaving them alone. Offering him a seat on the couch, she said, A decision that must be rethought. The other leaders will be arriving soon, and we will try to reach a consensus. Can you tell me more about these leaders? Paul asked. What would you like to know? Persephone asked. Why do you think you are enemies with the Keepers and Revenant? Paul asked. As far as the Revenant go, it's a long story, but most Vankari are unofficially allies of the Keepers. We only act like enemies for the sake of appearances, Persephone answered. Appearances? You mean being openly allied to them makes you seem weak? Paul asked. Unfortunately, you hit the nail on the head. It's stupid, but it's also a reality, Persephone admitted. You're joking, right? Paul asked, thinking how truly stupid this new concept was. It makes Vankari extremely difficult to deal with. Even I find it tiresome at times. The trouble is, if you break from the pattern of looking down on other races, you are seen as weak yourselves, and discover how quickly you can be isolated by the other groups, Persephone said. What if we stood together? Paul asked. Looking into his face, Persephone studied him for a moment. You're serious. Even if I were to put aside any personal feelings, an alliance between us makes sense. The only reason something like it hasn't happened before was because those who came before us could not see past their hatred, Paul explained. But what about your pack? Will they accept your decision? Persephone asked. You're assuming my pack lives in a democracy. I am the alpha, and what I say goes, Paul said. One of them could challenge you for your authority, Persephone said with a worried face. You think too little of me. I have defeated 2 alphas already. Let anyone try to take my pack from me if they dare. I have no intention of giving them up without a fight, Paul said without a hint of fear. In that case, why not? Persephone said with a grin. I'm glad that both of you are finally getting along, a voice said from behind them. Both of them turned and Persephone said, Greetings, Midian. Paul of the Were, may I introduce you to Midian, ruler of the Keepers? It is a pleasure, sir, Paul said, bowing his head in a show of respect, despite seeing what looked like a young teenager rather than a full-grown man. He looks like he is no older than 16, Paul said to himself. Actually, I'm a lot older, my young friend, Midian replied. When were you born? Paul asked. He could barely sense Midian's presence, even with the other man standing right in front of him. Try ancient Rome, Persephone said. Paul looked at Midian in disbelief. I was turned at the age you see me as, but I do not regret it. If you knew the story, you would understand why. Perhaps I will tell you it someday, but right now our other guest should be arriving, Midian said with a confident smile. They all felt him the moment he arrived. Greetings, Ceres, Midian said. It is a pleasure to see you again, my old friend. I see the Were here have finally found themselves a strong leader, Ceres said, nodding at Paul. One who is interested in finalizing a treaty that will remove unnecessary distractions so we can unite against a common enemy, Paul replied. Someone could say that you and the Vankari have grown soft, and that is why an outside clan is moving in, Ceres commented. You vampires and your indirect attacks. I will not waste my time playing your games, but if you need a demonstration of my strength, you have only to challenge me and I'll be happy to rip you apart, Paul retorted. Ceres glanced at Midian and raised an eyebrow. I wouldn't bait him if I were you, Midian suggested. My apologies, Alpha. I should have been more respectful, Ceres said with a bow to Paul. Turning to Persephone, Paul said, I suppose you have some suggestions for this treaty? I was unsure of what my fellows knew, Persephone replied. We know that you are not responsible for the recent attacks against each of us. The Vankari who raided us were tactically inept, Ceres said. I suppose that is good news, that whoever it is, they are underestimating the lot of us, Paul said. That is because their leader only rules a branch of the Mars clan, Midian replied. I should have expected trouble from his people. That clan has far too many rogue leaders that serve as his lieutenants, Persephone said. If you know their leader so well, perhaps you should plan our attack, Paul suggested. I know the head of their clan, not this lieutenant. Mars is old and powerful, not to mention ruthless. If we were facing him, things would be far worse, Persephone said. He can't be that bad, Paul said. Mars most certainly is. I myself have dealt with him on more than one occasion. He forced Persephone out of the city, and it was only at great cost to my people that he lost interest in Wolf Lake. If he is planning to return, I would prefer to crush his lieutenant and discourage that idea. Ceres replied. If this Mars character is as bad as you say, then, when your people attack and win, he will no doubt return to force you out in turn out of revenge, Paul pointed out. And what do you suggest, Alpha? That we allow his lieutenant free rein in our city because we fear his master? Ceres said. I suggest that my people take the forefront on this one, and your people draw them out by acting like you're retreating. Using that, we can lead our attackers to where we want them, and it will be the Were who earn the wrath of the Mars clan, Paul said. I could not in good conscience allow you to face our enemies alone, Persephone said. He's a big boy, Persephone. Besides, his plan serves two goals that will benefit all, Midian interjected. Another one of your insights, my friend? Ceres asked, turning to the younger-looking vampire. Indeed. His plan shows that the Were of this area are not only strong, but they look like they threw out the Vankari alone, and Mars won't know that we backed them, Midian explained. You said we're not werewolves, Ceres noticed. Midian smiled at him. I was wondering if you would notice. Paul now rules more than just a pack of werewolves. Of course, by that I mean no offence to our Alpha here, but it is considerably more impressive. How did you manage that? Ceres said, turning to Paul with raised eyebrows. He was born an Alpha, for one thing, Midian answered. Really? I understand that is a rarity among your kind, Ceres said, looking impressed. It has its advantages, Paul replied. There was a little more to it than that, but Paul saw no reason to inform a strange vampire on the specifics. He was putting enough trust in these people at the moment. If they all knew what he was truly capable, he might be in danger from them as well. Though Midian seemed well informed on the specifics, Paul could not get a sense as to what he would do with the information. While Midian lingered for a time, Ceres left immediately to pass the word on the plan. When he finally left, Paul and Persephone were finally alone. Are you sure you want to do this? She asked. You heard the reasons Midian supplied. It's as if he can read my mind, Paul said, looking out the window. Moving to join him, she leaned her head against his shoulder. He doesn't have to. He can see into your soul. Why do I have the disturbing impression you aren't joking? Paul replied. Because I'm not. Midian is the first of his race, which in most cases among us vampires that makes him the strongest of the keepers. His people have the power of influence because they can see all that we are, and love us for what they see, good or bad, Persephone said. If I didn't know any better, I would think it was impossible, Paul commented. The world is far bigger than you thought, Persephone replied. Still, I believe I can handle it, Paul said, wrapping his arm around her waist and drawing her closer. Paul had practiced sensing vampires with Persephone's help. Trying to do it while his target was far away was like feeling a slight buzz in the back of his mind. With training he could locate it, but mostly it was a matter of instinct, and his instincts, as it turned out, were very good. Paul felt his enemy's approach before his pack did, and best of all, the rival group Vankari didn't sense any indication of the ambush either. This was mainly due to the fact that he was masking all of them, using the forest itself as a covering background noise which allowed the Were to easily blend in. The pack would perform the dirty work on this one, while the rest of Paul's were acted as spies. Unwilling to leave anything to chance, he had hedged his bets by using them as an early warning system as they observed things in the city. Already he knew the Revenant's retreat had gone better than anyone had expected. Now he was about to spring the trap. Now? Rachel asked, causing Paul to smile. Rachel also had good instincts, and she was learning to read him. Without realizing it, he had given her some cue that told her the enemy was close. Take 10 volunteers and circle quietly to the right. I want you on their left flank when I give the signal, Paul said. Yes, Alpha, Rachel said with a smile and headed out. Rachel wasn't the only member of the pack that was eager for a chance at revenge. Like the Revenant, they too had suffered attacks by the Mars clan. Paul had chosen Rachel as the leader for her group because she would wait for his order rather than jumping the gun and ruining the whole plan. The enemy had to think they could beat whatever was out here until the moment it was too late to easily withdraw. That moment didn't take too long. When his spies informed him the enemy was in position, Paul sprung the trap. Attack! Shifting into wolf form, the pack fell upon the Mars Vankari, tearing them to pieces. Those few wars who mounted a good offense found out it wasn't only wolves they had to worry about. Fang had continued his recruiting drive and had some of his new wear lying in wait for the moment of attack. Where dogs and new wolves came to the aid of the pack. When one Vankari warrior prepared to deal a death blow to a fallen werewolf, 2 dogs jumped him, providing the wounded wolf the respite he needed to recover. Rejoining the fray, the young man went for Warrior's throat and helped bring him down. The fallen vampire soon became covered in blood-covered furry body that didn't stop attacking until he lay still and quiet. A few members of the pack died in the attack, but the Mars clan had lost 20 warriors and 6 shadow stalkers and 1 leader. Fang took the leader himself before he could organize a breakout. Mourning their dead many couldn't help but feel a certain pride in defeating their enemies so soundly. Kellis had reported his defeat to his master, asking for more help. What he expected was a messenger who would pass along Mars's answer, not Mars himself as he was announced before entry into Kellis's throne room. Rooms like this were common in the Mars clan, as each lieutenant copied his master and ruled like kings. There were no female rulers in their clan. Anyone who was not male was placed in a secondary position to their male counterparts. Until this moment, Kellis had considered himself Mars' favourite. Now he trembled at the sight of him. Mars might have been considered a handsome man until you noticed his cold gaze. His hair was black, as were his eyes. Some said the colour of his eyes reflected his heart. Both he and Kellis wore business suits, but Mars was still wearing his overcoat. Kellis doubted his lord wore it because of cold air outside, as his master was no longer affected by such things. When his gaze fell on Kellis, the junior vampire was trapped by it, his muscles freezing in place. "Explain yourself, Kellis. How did a bunch of beasts defeat my warriors?" Mars asked, as Kellis moved to meet him, not daring to sit in his master's presence. "We are still trying to find that out. The wolves weren't even supposed to be there. My men were supposed to be pursuing a group of revenant," Kellis said. "And in your eagerness to destroy your enemy, you fell into an obvious trap. Did it ever occur to you that the revenant could have disappeared at any time? It is almost impossible to corner them. All you can do is burn out their nests and chase them until they learn that it is not wise to stay in the city. Your mistake has not only cost us valuable warriors, but given our enemies hope. The Were saw the opportunity to attack us and took it. The question now is, were they working with the Revenant, or were they merely improvising?" "Who is their leader?" Mars asked. "I'm not sure, my lord. None of our spies who might have gotten any information have returned," Kellis said. Mars turned to Kellis's second-in-command, Naris, and ordered, "Withdraw our people from the city. We will move into a town nearby until we are ready to return." "But master, we can still take them," Kellis said, forgetting his fear in the shock of the moment. Mars' response was swift and violent as his fist slammed into Kellis' face. Kellis spat up blood as he was sent crashing to the floor, his jaw broken. Mercilessly, Mars placed his foot on the side of the fallen vampire's head, pressing down on it. As the pressure gradually increased, Kellis began to scream as his skull was crushed, and pinned as he was to the floor, he was helpless to stop it. Naris watched in horror as Kellis died horribly. When he was finished, Mars lifted his food out of the bloody mess that had been his former lieutenant. "Naris, you are now his replacement. Congratulations, and keep this moment in mind for the future. If you fail me as your former master did, I guarantee you when your time comes you will be envious of his death." Kneeling humbly before Mars, Naris said, "Thank you, my lord."